The Young and the Restless spoilers, Saturdays, full August 25th, 2025. Jack Abbott's patience has been sanded down to a raw edge, and Victoria Newman can feel the moral fissures inside Newman Enterprises widening even before the first press release hits the wire. Because what Victor has chosen to call a test has stopped looking like paternal oversight and started to look like weaponized control. In the boardrooms and private lounges of Genoa City, the story spreading is simple enough. Victor Newman will not void the coercive contract that shackles Kyle Abbott to a relationship standard he alone defines. Jack Abbott has taken that refusal as a personal assault. And somewhere between the chessboard and the battlefield stands Victoria, weighing whether the instincts that built her career can continue to coexist with the instincts of a father who never accepts limits. It is not merely a corporate storm or a tabloid-friendly spat. It is a test of governance, of legacy, of the thin line between a patriarch's protection and a tyrant's compulsion. Victoria knows the history, knows that for decades this rivalry with the Abbotts has incubated inside both companies like a dormant volcano. And she senses that if Victor pushes ahead under the test banner, the eruption won't be measured in stock points, but in people Claire, Kyle, Jack, dying burned by proximity to the blast. She runs the calculus that every good CEO runs: risk, timing, contingency. But the variables refuse to cooperate because the contract is a variable with a heartbeat, and its beating is Kyle's future. If she supports her father without reservation, she endorses a precedent that love and contracts can be made interchangeable. If she resists him, she risks a rupture in the Newman command chain that enemies will exploit. In her office with the door closed, Victoria turns the question over and over: can she trust her father's judgment here? And finds only partial answers. She respects his brilliance and doubts his restraint, and in that tension, the daughter and the executive in her pull in opposite directions. On the other side of town, Jack's temper, usually muzzled until necessary, has been unsheathed by the spectacle of a man he has fought for a lifetime publicly congratulating himself for cornering Jack's son. The confrontation, when it comes, is almost ritualistic. Jack accuses Victor of pointing a sword at Kyle and calling it a safety belt. He lays bare his knowledge of the contract's language and the nice entanglement with Audra. He names the maneuver for what it is pressure dressed up as mentorship and demands a simple remedy: tear up the paper and return agency to the two young adults who are supposed to be in a relationship, not a compliance exercise. Victor's answer is simple and immovable. He calls the contract a test of character and claims that by signing it, Kyle showed greater courage than he has shown across his entire life. He appointed knife of a compliment that cuts Jack on the way in and on the way out. Where Jack sees coercion, Victor sees character formation. Where Jack sees a father protecting his child, Victor sees a rival shielding a weak link. The refusal is categorical. There will be no tearing up. And that word "no," delivered with the familiar Newman calm, does exactly what Jack feared it would. It turns a family disagreement into a public declaration of war. Diane Jenkins Abbott, who has pleaded for off-ramps and de-escalation, can feel the air pressure drop as to patriarchs switch off their governors. She knows better than most that once Jack's temper crosses a certain threshold, principle and vengeance begin to braid together until they are indistinguishable. And she can see that threshold receding in the rearview mirror. Billy hears the rumblings and starts preparing the countermeasures he always prepares when Jack and Victor set the city on a collision course. Talent retention plans at Jabbo in case Newman poaches on the edges. Legal consultations about the enforceability of a morals with penalties agreement tied to a romantic relationship. Quiet calls to media allies to shape the narrative if Victor's camp leaks first. The machinery of feud whirs back to life. In the middle of this machinery stand Kyle and Claire, trying to conduct a relationship in a vacuum chamber that refuses to stay sealed. Kyle does what he should have done earlier. He apologizes clearly and without hedging, tells Claire he loves her, tells her that he wants the past to stay the past. that he has learned in a humiliating, public way how every small lie becomes a canyon when the wrong hands hold the echo. Claire surprises him with a grace that is not performative but practical. She answers that the Victor episode now belongs behind them alongside the debris that has long cluttered their path. And she says she has told Nate Hastings everything, the whole package of doubt, fear, and the line she refuses to let anyone cross again. That admission does not come from malice. It comes from a woman setting her own guardrails, enlisting a friend with clinical distance to help her keep perspective when the family drama tries to pull her under. But even as she extends forgiveness, Claire keeps a scientist's eye on the variables that could contaminate the experiment of rebuilding trust among them Audra Charles, whose relationship with the truth is opportunistic at best. Audra continues to lie, not always in grand strokes, but in meticulous omissions, the kind that preserve leverage while muddying timelines. She does not confess because confession without strategy is a surrender she never grants, and as long as the nice narrative remains contracted, half in shadow, she can sell different versions of the same night to different buyers. Claire knows this, which is why her forgiveness to Kyle comes paired with vigilance. Love is not blind here. It is simply choosing not to look away from the work. Then comes the shock that knocks the air from Jack and Diane in the way only a son's unexpected decision can. Kyle, calculating the damage vectors and the places where Victor's leverage bites deepest, chooses a move that neither parent anticipates. He informs them he will step back immediately and voluntarily from his operational role at Jabbo, placing his duties in abeyance and his voting influence in a blind trust administered by counsel outside the family, and he will publicly align himself with Claire on a philanthropic initiative seated at Newman with strictly delineated governance, third-party auditors, and an ironclad ethics charter that explicitly prohibits Victor or any Newman officer from exercising personal leverage over either partner under threat of clawbacks and automatic dissolution. On its face, it is a sacrifice and a strategic innovation in one breath. He removes the talking point that Jack is sheltering him inside Jabbo and that his proximity to Abbott Capital is contaminating his judgment. He builds a space where Claire can stand with him without the constant accusation that he is surfing the Abbott name. And he erects legal architecture that weaponizes transparency against coercion. But to Jack and Diane, the headline is simpler and harsher. Their son is voluntarily stepping away from the house he was raised to help protect at the precise moment an old enemy is revving the engines. Shock arrives not because they think the ethics charter is naive can see its merit, but because in the optics war that Victor loves to wage, a step away can be edited into a retreat. And a retreat can be edited into proof that the Abbotts blinked first. Diane's face cycles through the entire spectrum: pride at Kyle's maturity, fear at the timing, anger at the circumstances that made such a contortion necessary, while Jack's reaction is less mixed. It is almost purely protective outrage at a world in which his son's best path to love is to amputate parts of his professional identity to keep a predator from sniffing blood. Victoria watches all of this from her vantage point inside Newman and finds her internal question hardening into an external problem. If she endorses her father's test framing now, she also endorses a culture where contracts crawl out of the boardroom to police intimacy, and that is not a corporate precedent she wants strangling the company when she is gone, let alone while she remains. She has already confided to Nate that she told him everything, which is less a call for sympathy than a request for a second mind. She wants someone who will tell her when the personal logic of a family fight is on a collision course with the fiduciary logic of a public company. In their conversations, the contours sharpen. Victor's move may be brilliant as leverage, but it is brittle as policy. It assumes permanent compliance, it externalizes family risk into corporate reputation, and it converts a private reconciliation into a public liability. Victoria tests countermeasuresting the firewall between Newman HR and personal matters, codify a prohibition on morals contracts tied to romantic partnerships. insists that any charitable vehicle involving family members be ring-fenced and audited by outsiders who cannot be swayed by patriarchal pressure, and each measure feels like both a solution and a rebuke. She is not trying to strip her father of his mythic authority. She is trying to protect the Enterprise from the day his myth crashes into a wall reality will not move. The question of trust becomes a question of boundaries. She can trust her father to win wars. Can she trust him to choose the right wars for the right reasons at the right cost? The answer, for the first time in a long time, is not an automatic yes. Meanwhile, the old vectors of aggression reconstitute. Victor signals subtly in some rooms, bluntly in others, that the so-called test has already begun to improve Kyle, that only men who fear hard choices complain about the terms of their trials. And he refuses Jack's demand to shred the contract with a serenity that is more maddening than any outburst could be. Jack, in response, moves from moral argument to tactical action. He retains counsel to challenge the contract's enforceability under public policy doctrine, as no court of equity will bless a punitive clause tethered to a private romantic relationship, while simultaneously instructing his media allies to shine a forensic light on the instrument's origins. Who drafted it? Who witnessed? What disclosures were made? What pressures were exerted? Whether any Newman assets were used to coerce signature? He does not do this to humiliate Claire. He does it because exposure is the only disinfectant left when two men refuse to trust each other's intentions. Billy prepares for the inevitable retaliatory whispers about Javit's governance, old personal missteps dragged into new contexts, and Diane becomes the house's shock absorber, taking the calls, softening Jack's hardest edges when strategy demands discipline over catharsis. And then there is Audra, orbiting the truth like a comet that never quite burns up, her lies adaptive, her memories selective, her talent for survival undiminished. She presents herself to different audiences with different proofs. To one, she is the scapegoat of two powerful families. To another, the woman who knows exactly what happened in Nice and has the receipts to time the release for maximum effect. To a third, a reformed operator, just trying to avoid becoming collateral damage. She is all of these and none of them, and that is why she remains dangerous. For as long as she can keep the nice narrative fractionalized facts here, some facts there can keep both Victor and Jack wary, both Kyle and Claire off balance. Claire's strategy is the correct one against such a shapeshifter. Tell the truth to the person. You must be able to look in the eye every morning, sit your line, and refuse to move it. Kyle's apology lands because it is plain, not curated. His promise lands because he accepts conditions, not because he tries to negotiate them away. But both of them know that a relationship rebuilt under floodlights requires constant maintenance, and in a city where secrets catalyze faster than trust, maintenance is not a metaphor, it is a daily practice. By week's end, the lines are drawn clearly enough for even casual observers to map them. Victor will not tear up the contract. He will continue calling it a test with outcomes only he is qualified to measure. Jack will not stand down. He will escalate privately in court and publicly in narrative until the pressure makes someone else bored, judge, or fate tier the paper for him. Victoria will not rubber stamp the culture that produced the contract. She will begin installing structural guardrails that, by their existence, challenge the assumption that the patriarch's word is always the last one. Claire will not outsource her boundaries. She will forgive but verify, love but audit, and keep Nate in the loop as a prophylactic against self-deception. Kyle will not pretend the past never happened. He will step back where stepping back removes leverage from his enemies and step forward where stepping forward restores his dignity. Diane will not implode. She will absorb the shock of a son's hard choice and channel the pain into a steadiness Jack needs if he is to fight smart instead of only fighting hard. And Audra will not confess until confession pays better than the lie. If there is a single image that captures this chapter, it is the one formed by Jack's accusation and Victor's reply, a sword dressed up as a lesson, a contract framed as courage. Between those two images lives the entire tragedy of Newman versus Abbott inability of either patriarch to perceive the other's righteousness as anything but camouflage for aggression. Victoria's quiet doubt threads through the tableau like a necessary antidote, a reminder that power unchecked eventually confuses victory with virtue. Kyle and Claire's tentative reconciliation offers a counter-narrative, one in which love is neither naive nor punitive but boundary-literate, willing to pay a price that is chosen rather than extorted. Whether that counter-narrative can survive the next volley an opportunely timed leak, an injunction granted or denied, a public spectacle engineered to humiliate will determine not only the fate of two young people but the temperature of the war their elders keep reheating. For now, Genoa City waits in that familiar posture, heads bowed toward their phones. Eyes on the door of society and the glass elevators at Newmonk, knowing that when men like Victor and Jack choose to escalate, the first explosion is rarely the last. And the aftershocks have a way of finding every crack in every family and prying them just a little wider. Kyle had told himself that contrition would be enough, that the simple architecture of an apology owning the mistake, pledging better, vowing transparency could hold the weight of what he had left unsaid, but Claire had learned to hear the soft rattle of missing pieces long before he stepped into the room, and she refused to accept a confession with hollow spaces where facts should live. She began with the most humane question possible, a doorway rather than a trap. Was there anything he had not told her about Nice, about Audra, about that sweltering pocket of time in France when gravity seemed to tilt toward bad decisions and convenient lies? It was not an accusation, so much as a request for the last inch of truth, the inch that separates a relationship from a performance. Kyle reached for his well-rehearsed refrain, had no feelings for Audra. None at all, and Claire surprised him by nodding. She already believed that. What she needed was not reassurance about the heart, but clarity about the timeline, the logistics, the moments that could not survive in shadow if trust were to exist at all. It was then, as if jolted by the echo of his parents' warnings, that Kyle understood the cost of omission. He could hear Jack and Diane in his head if you hide the worst of it. You will pay twice, and the self-protective walls he had erected began to list under their own hypocrisy. So he did what he should have done the first time, when he'd still had the benefit of her unbroken patience. He admitted there was more. He said the word trap out loud, his word, not hers. He claimed he had baited Audra to expose her, that he had allowed a kiss, that the moment in Nice was not some accidental brush of lips in a loud bar, but a deliberate test in a place chosen to minimize witnesses and maximize leverage. Claire's face didn't harden, it focused, and she asked the precise question any person with an intact sense of self-respect would ask. Where? Exactly. He answered with a specificity that made his earlier vagueness feel like an insult. The sleeper coach, his compartment. The kind of cramped intimacy that turns inches into implications, and the room changed temperature. The geography of his admission mattered because it condensed the lie. A kiss in public can be framed as impulse, as foolishness. A kiss in a private cabin reads like engineering. Claire heard the difference and pursued it, not to humiliate him, but to map the boundaries of the danger she had been asked to forgive. How far did it go? She wanted to know, and Kyle, cornered by the truth he had finally let in the door, panicked in the way that men panic when the last easy version of their story evaporates. He said he had endured a little, that he had calibrated proximity to flesh her out, that the real point of the operation he used the word and hated himself for it was to unmask Audra rather than touch her. There are excuses that die peacefully under scrutiny and excuses that self-immolate. This one did the latter. Claire had asked for honesty at the beginning, and she had received a draft of honesty sans the critical paragraph. And now she stood confronted with a sequence that only resolved into coherence once she assumed he was not simply withholding, but curating. If he had pursued a sting, why had he not told her the moment he returned? If he had kissed a woman in a private space as a tactic, why had he allowed her to reconstruct the truth by increments dragged from his mouth? If he had no feelings for Audra and the kiss meant nothing, why did the facts around the kiss look so much like premeditation? The rage that rose in her was not theatrical. It was the heat generated when logic collides with evasion. She told him, voice raised, not to wound him, but to break the trance that he had promised to be honest and then rationed honesty like a scarce commodity, that she had received more directness from Audra, of all people, than from the man who claimed to love her. The comparison stung precisely because it was plausible. Audra lies to win. Kyle had lied to survive. To Claire, the outcomes felt the same. He apologized again, and there is a bleakness to apologies made under duress that can swallow even the most sincere intention. He knew it as the words left his mouth. That flavor of "I'm sorry" tainted by the fact that it arrived in response to evidence rather than conscience. Claire heard it too. She did not deny the possibility that he loved her. She denied the premise that love without voluntary truth could do anything but rot from the inside. When she told him that he was only speaking because she had pressed him, she was not punishing him for confessing late. She was naming a patterned kind that unravels trust twice, once in the initial offense and again in the discovery that the truth would have remained hidden if not for the question. That double injury is the one relationships rarely survive, and he felt the floor under them tilt as she asked the simplest, cruelest hypothetical. If she had not asked, would he have kept lying? The question remained unanswered because any answer would have been a self-indictment. He pivoted to the words that once worked on her because they were once true in a way that felt weightless. Loved her. She made him better. He wanted the past to be static, not radioactive. She had evolved past the phase where declarations could suspend investigation. She told him she wasn't sure she could make this less terrible than it already was, and when she walked out, it wasn't a door slam staged for effect. It was a controlled exit by a woman protecting the last intact pieces of her self-belief. The absence she left behind was colder than any accusation could have been. The immediate aftermath for Kyle was silence and arithmetic. He replayed the night in nice without the defensive narration he had used to frame it for himself, and discovered, with the nauseating clarity that follows a lost argument, that every rationalization he had leaned on was built on an unexamined premise, that he, not Claire, was the authority on what facts were necessary for Claire to know. He had called it a trap and persuaded himself that assigning a noble verb to the decision sanitized the noun. He had told himself that if the kiss meant nothing emotionally, its logistical features, cabin, the isolation, the deliberate allowance of intimacy, were merely medium, not message. He had told himself that confession would only empower the people who wanted to control him, that keeping the uglier parts in the dark was a form of protection for Claire rather than a form of control over Claire. Each of those assumptions collapsed under the weight of the single demand she had made: truth in full, not truth in servings. The cost was immediate. He understood that the credibility he had invested in his first apology had depreciated to almost nothing because currency loses value when counterfeits circulate. And he also understood that the problem was not only romantic. In Genoa City, nothing quarantines for long. If Claire told Natia's she hated, if Nate advised Victoria's, he mightn't if Victoria used that knowledge to push back against Victor's test framing inside Newman. Then the chain reaction would move beyond the private sphere and into the public, where Victor thrives. And if Victor learned that Kyle's final truth only arrived under pressure, he would reframe the entire arc as proof that the contract had already accomplished its goal. It had revealed character, not built it. That is the repugnant elegance of coercive instruments. They convert any failure into validation of their premise. Claire's walk down the corridor was not a declaration of separation. Not yet. It was a recalibration in motion. She had forgiven worse than a kiss before in her life, but she had never forgiven the erasure of her right to measure harm with the correct facts in her hands. In the elevator's mirrored panels, she saw a woman who had learned to operate in systems designed by patriarchs who insist that love requires obedience to their narratives. And she refused to replicate that dynamic in miniature. She did not want to punish Kyle. Punishment is a spectacle. She wanted to reestablish consent around information itself. If you love me, you cannot decide which pieces of the truth I am allowed to carry. If you respect me, you cannot outsource disclosure to fate and interrogation. If you want a future with me, the truth must arrive before my question, not after. The practical steps followed the principle. She texted Nate to say the conversation had happened and that she needed 48 hours without advice. Just space. She blocked Audra for a day because even victory laps via insinuation contaminate clarity. She scheduled a meeting with legal to review the philanthropic framework she and Kyle had discussed for a joint initiative, not to spite him with procedural rigor, but to make sure that any future structure they built together would be immune to leverage that traveled on the back of secrets. Her love, in other words, did not dissolve, it professionalized. And that is often the most grievous wound a betrayal inflicts, not the end of feeling, but the end of spontaneity. The ripples found Jack and Diane before the gossip columns could. Parents know the sound of a child's voice after a wound, even when the child is a grown man who thinks he has mastered the art of damage control. When Kyle told them the fuller version omitting Claire's accusations, but unable to hide, the out comedian felt a layered ache for the woman who had been asked to build a life on an incomplete story, for the son who had confused strategy with integrity, and for the family that was, once again, living out the Numanabit disease of weaponizing intimacy in the name of protection. Jack's response was flint and weathered tenderness. He did not defend his son's omission show, could he? When he had taught him with every speech and every scar that truth told late is truth discounted. But he also refused to let Victor's fingerprint on the larger picture fade. Whatever Kyle had done, Victor's apparatus had made it easier by preloading the environment with surveillance and consequence. Whatever Audra had chosen, Victor's orbit had given her an audience and an incentive. Jack vowed, again, to tear the contract from the equation by law if necessary, because as long as it existed, every admission in Kyle's personal life could be harvested and monetized by a patriarch who had convinced himself that paternal authority translated into moral jurisdiction. Diane, ever the realist, urged to Trax, repair what could be repaired with Claire through the only courtesy that Matterson solicited. Unqualified Truthand let the lawyers grind the contract to dust without turning Kyle's private contrition into public fodder. The strategy was elegant because it honored the two different theaters of the war, the interior one, where love either grows or doesn't, and the exterior one, where power either yields or doubles down. And Audra, hearing through her channels that a new confession had widened the fracture, did what Audra always does when the market moves. She repriced her storytelling. To some audiences, she became the woman who had been honest from the start. I told Claire more than Kyle did. She could credibly imply, while to others, she recast herself as the whistleblower trapped in a long con for which she should receive at least partial credit for refusing to consummate. The danger in her narrative is not that it is entirely false. It is that it contains enough granules of truth to sandpaper reputation smooth. Claire will not litigate that in public because she refuses to be a protagonist in Audra's revenue stream. But every half-true sentence that leaks into the bloodstream of Genoa city forces Kyle to live with a reality he has finally begun to understand. The hardest part of telling the truth late is not the apology, it is the forfeiture of authorship. Once you delay disclosure, other people start telling your story for you, and you cannot get it back by outrunning them. The only corrective is an inconvenient transparency that arrives before the subpoena, before the confrontation, before the question in the doorway. Kyle knows that now, and knowledge, while late, is not useless. It gives him his next move, if he is brave enough to make it. A complete accounting to Claire without defensive framing, without self-exonerating context, without the word trap as absolution, followed by a willingness to accept whatever she decides because decisions require dignity to be real. Whether that dignity can be recovered in a city where every secret looks like a headline and every headline looks like a weapon will depend on both of them choosing, again and again, to be adults in a narrative that rewards adolescence. For now, the door is closed and the house is quiet, and that quiet contains the only question that matters, not whether love remains, but whether the architecture can still support it when the missing beams have finally been named. At Crimson Lights, where the ambient clatter of cups and the low murmur of mid-morning regulars tend to soften hard conversations into something almost manageable, Victoria and Nikki chose the corner table that has witnessed more Newman strategy than most boardrooms. The topic, as it so often is these days, was Clara specifically whether Victor's promise to stop engineering the edges of her relationship with Kyle could be trusted to hold under pressure. Victoria kept her voice steady, but her fingers betrayed the tension, turning the porcelain mug just so, aligning the handle first with the saucer. Then, with the table's grain because what she was weighing was not merely a father's word, but a patriarch's reflex. She admitted she could not tell if the reprieve was real or tactical, a pause before the next intervention disguised as protection. Nikki, seasoned by a lifetime of loving the man and surviving the storms he generates, offered the kindest version of truth she could. In his heart, Victor wants Claire safe and happy, but trusting Kyle fully may be a mountain he refuses to climb. It was not cynicism. Only experienced sector's love is unequivocal. His trust is conditional, and conditions have a way of turning romance into a contract. The phone on the table buzzed, a small, insistent insect of a notification. Victoria glanced down, set it face down in a practiced motion, and in the tiny pause Nikki reached to reposition it and caught the image on the lock screen, a photo of Nikki and Cole Howard's sunlight on shoulders. The kind of candid that makes memory feel recent even when it isn't. That picture tugged a cord that had survived time, mistakes, reconciliations, and all the ways life reroutes what you thought was settled. Victoria, reading her mother's expression as easily as reading a text, reached into her bag and placed a small key in Nikki's palm, one Cole had mailed from Serbia, with a note about a riverside bridge where couples fasten padlocks to the railing and toss the key, trusting water and distance to guard their vow. Cole hadn't locked anything with Victoria. He had sent the key, empty of a lock, a gesture that could be read as benediction or invitation, depending on the day. Victoria framed it as a symbol of continuity and choice. Some bridges are literal, some are metaphors, and the key in Nikki's hand might belong to both kinds. The talk curved back, inevitably, to the present tense of Claire's life. Nikki, thinking like a chairwoman and a mother in the same breath, mentioned that she intended to elevate a drawn impulse that, in Newman circles, always carries multiple valences, reward capability, signal confidence to the market, tether a volatile talent to clear responsibility. Victoria didn't challenge the decision, though in her silence lived the recognition that promoting Audra meant absorbing the reputational risk Audra brings wherever she goes. And then the door chimed, and Claire stepped into the coffee shop, soft noise with the kind of contained composure you only earn after a sleepless night. She did not draw it out. She told them first Nikki, then Victoria that Kyle had just confessed he kissed Audra on his sleeper berth in Nice, that it wasn't a crowded bar or a misread moment on a balcony, but a kiss inside a private space where intimacy wasn't an accident, but a plan he now insisted was bait in a trap he set to expose Audra. Nikki's response came with the kind of precision you reserve for wounds that sting more because of where they land than how hard they hit. Shock at the location and the calculation. The recognition that logistics tell a truth the heart sometimes tries to edit. Claire didn't cry, and she didn't dramatize. She laid out what moderate facts, her request for honesty made early and ignored until pressed. Her refusal to accept a love that arrives only after interrogation as if she were sorting documents on a conference table. This stays, this goes, this needs more time. Nikki counseled space before verdict, the seasoned advice of someone who has forgiven and not regretted it, and, at other times, forgiven and paid for it twice. Victoria echoed the call for time not because she wanted Claire to keep the relationship at any cost, but because she knows that decisions made in the first 24 hours often obligate the next 24 months. Claire nodded. She would work, she said, because she has learned that motion keeps the mind from spiraling, and she would not promise forgiveness today. She would promise only that she wouldn't let rage make a decision Mercy would later revise. Outside the circle of women drawing boundary lines with steadiness, Kyle was discovering the physics of delayed truth. Once you tell the worst part last, every earlier word loses weight. He walked into society looking like a man who had run a marathon only to find the finish line had moved. Jack and Diane were already see-10th choreography of their expressions an atlas of parenthood. Fear for the child, anger at the world that tempts him, frustration at the lesson he should have already learned, and an undercurrent of unconditional loyalty that refuses to be embarrassed by love. Kyle didn't perform. Performance is what had landed him here. He said it plain. Life told Claire everything. The compartment, the kiss, the flawed rationale about trapping Audrond. The result was exactly what a sober mind would predict. It blew up. He owned the timeline of omission. He did not try to recast it as strategy. Diane felt the intake of breath that signals a mother's ache. She reached for Kyle's hand not to absolve him, but to prevent the shame spiral from swallowing him before they could do anything useful. Jack, equal parts steel and weathered empathy, didn't waste the opportunity to remind his son that truth offered freely is the only kind that strengthens love. But he also refused to indulge the fatalism that rides in on the back of a bad Dano. This isn't over if you're willing to do the work. Yes, the work costs something. Yes, you will pay it without guarantees. Kyle nodded as if the words were landing in a place where decisions congeal. And then he said the only sentence that sounded like a choice rather than a reaction. He needed to prove his love with action, not speeches. And before either parent could question whether grand gestures belong in the same room as broken trust, he placed his plan on the table with the same clarity that had been missing from his confession. He would propose to Claire, not as a stunt, not as PR, not as a bandage pressed over an unstitched wound, but as a vow tied to structure, an engagement that begins with full disclosure. A public statement that any venture they launch together, philanthropy, business, or otherwise, will be governed by third-party oversight immune to family pressure. A private commitment to counseling that does not wait for a crisis to recur. And a formal letter to Victor and to both family boards making explicit that their relationship is not a lever to be pulled in corporate games. The ring would not be a bribe, it would be a document of intent, co-signed by discipline. If that sounds naive to cynics, it sounded like evolution to Diane, who has lived long enough to know that apology without architecture rarely survives the next stress test. Jack didn't bless it immediately. He is allergic to marrying impulse with penance. But he couldn't deny that there was rigor in the outline of protections against the very forces that had deformed the relationship in the first place. A kind of prenup for honesty and autonomy, rather than assets. He warned his son that proposals, like contracts, can become theater when the audience is too large. Make sure the first person to see the ring is Claire, not Genoa City. He warned him that saying "marry me" the day after you admitted you lied can sound like you're replacing truth with spectacle. The timing must carry humility, not desperation. And he warned him that Victor believes in tests will try to grade this one as well. But he also gave his son what sons need most at the brink, permission to try and fail honorably rather than drift and fail by default. Kyle stood, lighter by inches, and promised that whatever came next would be brought to Claire first and without editing. Back at Crimson Lights, Victoria watched her mother turn Cole's key over in her fingers, then slip it into her bag with the same care she reserves for keepsakes that are also tools, and understood that objects only matter for the stories we let them carry. A key from a bridge thousands of miles away can be a nostalgia trap or a map. A contract brandished by a patriarch can be protection or control. A ring can be purchase or promise. The women at the table have been reduced to symbols in other people's narratives before. Today they chose to be authors instead. Claire walked out with work to do and a mind like a ledger columns for truth, for repair, for the time a heart requires to feel safe again. Nikki walked out with a policy decision to finalize and a private message to answer, both of which would demand courage of different kinds. Victoria walked out with the resolve to hold her father accountable without breaking faith and the clarity to put in writing what should have been obvious. At Newman, love and leverage are not synonyms, and any test that confuses them has no place in the bylaws. And somewhere between the coffee shop and the ring box, Kyle rehearsed a proposal that does not ask for instant absolution, but offers a future built like a good bridge-weight bearing because every bolt has been checked and every hidden seam named. Whether Claire chooses to cross that bridge now, later, or not at all will be her decision, not anyone else's, and that, finally, is the only test that matters.